So our first speaker is Straughan. And I will admit, I didn't even know that the men's rights movement existed until a few years ago, and even when I did know about it, I didn't really know what it was about. And when people ask me, recommended to have Karen here, it kind of confused me. Why is a woman talking about men's issues? But after watching a few of her videos online, I was pleasantly surprised, and I hope her perspective opens up your minds, and yeah, enjoy. Now I'd like to invite Jesse up to the stage. He's the Vice President of SFU Advocacy for Better Boys, and yeah, he's going to introduce you to Karen.
Our first speaker is a blogger and vlogger who has become the voice of anti-feminism online. Through her own efforts and those of the Honey Badger, she has inspired dozens to produce their own content, educated thousands, and offended millions. She's been interviewed by many prominent journalists, including CBC, CTV, and the BBC, and her crowning achievement is having Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks tell her to make him a sandwich. She's spoken at the New Hampshire and New York Libertarian conferences, so this isn't her first rodeo. Given that she comes from Alberta, nobody should be surprised. Please welcome the woman, the legend, the rape apologist, Karen Straughan.
Okay. You can all hear me? Yeah. Okay. I just want to thank Students for Liberty for inviting me, and I also want to thank the weather for giving me a unique experience, which is, it's not every day someone with this hair actually gets frizz. So, with that out of the way, I'm going to preface my speech with a trigger warning. I am an anti-feminist. I know the short hair, the comfortable shoes, that really gave it away. But I am one of the bad people, and like any other supervillain, I spend most of my time spreading my horrible, evil message, anywhere I can. Internet, magazines, newspapers, on TV and radio programs occasionally, pretty much everywhere I can manage it. But don't despair, because I'm also going to preface this speech by clarifying that there are many feminisms, and the feminism that I talk about is not the feminism you're going to find in the dictionary. It's not just the movement for social, political, and equality for women. The feminism I'm going to talk about today is the feminism that is usually found in women's studies, gender studies, and interdisciplinary studies classes. It's the feminism found on the women's page of The Guardian, blogs like Jezebel. It's the feminism found in organizations like the National Organization for Women. It is not just a movement, it's an ideology based largely on Marxist class conflict theory, and it's propped up by subjectivist, postmodernist philosophies. So it's not really a goal, it's a worldview, it's a perceptual lens and a set of philosophical tools. And it's based on a set of axioms that don't and indeed cannot change, that women as a class are oppressed to the benefit and privileging of men. It's the feminism of Valerie Solanas, of Andrea Dworkin, of Catherine McKinnon and Simone de Beauvoir, of Gloria Steinem, Robin Morgan, Jessica Valenti, Naomi Wolf, Laurie Penny, Clementine Ford, and Amanda Marcotte. There do exist a handful of feminists I greatly admire, and I'm going to salute them here. Kathy Young, Wendy McElroy, Christina Hoff Sommers, Catherine Kitchens. There are feminists of the past I very much admire, Karen DeCrow, having just passed away last year, and even going all the way back to the suffragettes, like equalitarian suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst. All of these women shared something in common. They shared a viewpoint that men are not the enemies of women, and never have been, and that equality is necessarily a two-way street. So there are many feminisms, and the feminism I'm going to talk about today is highly dogmatic, it's a politicized branch of the movement, it's one that thrives in the halls of power and breeds in campuses and universities across the Western world. Anybody old enough to remember, you guys probably aren't old enough to remember, Marlo Thomas's 1972 project, Free to Be You and Me. You might be tempted to declare that feminism is indeed a friend of freedom. This project was affiliated with the Ms. Foundation for Women, and it encouraged both boys and girls to not let society's expectations of gender hold them down, dictate who and what they could be and become. But within the history of the wider feminist movement, all the way back to the 1850s, there's always existed a streak of illiberalism a mile wide. From the support of alcohol prohibition by suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, to Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst's vigorous campaigns in favor of military draft in Britain, all the way into the modern era with the examples I'm going to share with you today, individual liberty and authoritarianism have been strange feminist bedfellows. Simone de Beauvoir even once asserted that women should not be authorized to stay home and build families, because if they were given the choice, too many women would take it. Where, I would ask, is there room for individual liberty in that? Today, despite a lip service dedication to individualism and freedom, we can observe this continuing conflict between libertarian and authoritarian ideals in many, many areas of feminist thought and activism. In the National Organization for Women's support of the US's proposed Paycheck Fairness Act. As early as 1982, Thomas Sowell had determined that there was no pay gap between men and women. The gap that existed was an earnings gap between women who had been or were married and everybody else. Subsequent studies done through the US Department of Labor and even the American Association of University Women have borne out his research. When you compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, men and women in the US and in Canada and in Britain and pretty much everywhere else in the West are paid roughly the same. The raw wage gap that is usually trotted out by feminists and politicians, that women are paid 77 cents or 78 cents on a man's dollar, is a misleading statistic. It doesn't account for hours worked per day, per week, or per year. It doesn't account for level of education, choice of field, willingness to work in unpleasant or dangerous conditions, willingness to put in overtime, which is typically remunerated at a higher rate than regular hours, the lengthy interruptions in career women tend to take when they have children, willingness to travel for work or to relocate for a job. These are all factors that are largely responsible for skewing the wage gap in men's favor. Even in studies that determine the real adjusted wage gap is between 2 and 7%, which incidentally applies to most Western nations as well, there are factors that cannot be quantified accurately enough and are therefore left out of calculations. Anyone here would probably agree that if you're willing to work lots of overtime, you're probably more likely to get promoted and get pay raises. But we can't quantify exactly what effect that has on somebody's earnings, so that's always left out of these studies. And another one that's always usually left out is men's greater willingness to negotiate their salary. We don't know exactly how much that affects men's pay overall, so we leave it out. The raw wage gap in the US for individuals under 30 right now, however, without children, has been skewing in women's favor for a decade or more. In some cities in the US right now today, women, single women under 30 out-earn their male counterparts by up to 27%, which may be a function of the steadily decreasing educational attainment for men, which Cafe could tell you all about. This is a trend that now exists in every single Western nation. Women comprise the majority of those enrolled in post-secondary school, the majority of graduates at every single level. And this generation of men in Canada and the US will be the first in hundreds of years to, on average, have less education than their fathers. It's been illegal to pay men and women differently for the same work in both Canada and the US since 1963. Yet the wage gap persists, and it persists largely because making beds and cleaning bathrooms in a hotel a quick bus ride from home 5 days a week is just going to cost less than doing that same job in a work camp in northern Alberta 21 days in a row, 7 off. It persists because being a school teacher might require more education and specialization than working on an oil rig. But it doesn't involve being outdoors in minus 40-degree temperatures, risking your health and your limbs thousands of miles away from your family for weeks at a time. The same factors that influence average yearly pay for men and women, resulting in a gap of 20-something cents, also influence the fact that for every 7 women who die on the job, 93 men will. But that's not a gap that we talk about a whole lot in society. The Paycheck Fairness Act would bring in draconian measures requiring employers to disclose not only what they're paying their employees, but would require them, often through expensive litigation, to justify why they, for instance, pay their shipper receivers and warehouse employees, who are mostly men, more than their cashiers, who are mostly women. It would require courier companies to justify why they pay the mostly women who answer their phones less than they pay the men who go out in all weather in heavy traffic and lug heavy parcels to your door. I was in New Hampshire last year speaking at the Free State Project's Liberty Forum, and I had the privilege of sitting on a panel with feminist Naomi Wolf. A wonderful young woman named Amanda Billyrock stood up in the audience during the question and answer period and said she didn't want equal pay legislation. What she wanted was the right to negotiate her own contracts. Simply stated, she wanted the right to demand more money than the next guy if she felt she was worth it, and she also wanted the right to undersell him, to offer her skills and her services for less if it could edge the other guy out for a job. The raw gender wage gap is almost entirely the result of free choices of individuals to arrange their lives as they see fit. Yet, this is a huge problem we need feminism to solve. And they are fully in support of coercive legislation to eliminate it, all the while misinterpreting what the statistic actually means and represents. And how many times have you heard those two sentences put together? It's a travesty that in 2015, women still are paid 78 cents for every dollar a man is paid. Women deserve equal pay for equal work. Both of those sentences are factually correct, but they have nothing to do with each other. More than this, if you understand why the wage gap exists, can anyone argue that it represents an injustice against women? To have the freedom to take a year off when you have a child. Is that an injustice against women? That women have that option, that women overwhelmingly make the choice to work in an office rather than in a cherry picker fixing power lines? It's people's freedom to make their own choices. That's what is being held up to us as an injustice that requires legislation to fix. Is Simone de Beauvoir correct in saying women should not be authorized to make their own choices? Because if they are, they will make choices she doesn't like. Another area where feminism has exposed itself as an enemy of freedom is in its support of speech codes on campuses across the Western world. In the US, there is a growing movement to put trigger warnings on books like Huckleberry Finn and The Great Gatsby, which would allow students to opt out of studying them. And in Canada, there have been suggestions to essentially no platform male students, to not allow them to speak in the classroom until the women had had their turn. Because apparently, allowing a man to speak at all silences women's voices. In the UK, the song Blurred Lines was banned from some campuses on the grounds that it is a rape anthem, despite the fact that any sane person reading the lyrics to that song will realize it's an enthusiastic consent anthem. Also in the UK, the women's branch of the National Student Union required conference goers recently to refrain from applauding, as the noise can trigger anxiety and panic attacks in people who have trauma in their lives. They suggested that feminist jazz hands instead would be a good way to show your approval of a speaker. I kid you not. Or sizzle fingers. Can you imagine a whole room? That would just be eerie. Everybody's just going like this, and I'd be like, where am I just want to go now. Prominent speakers such as Ann Coulter and Condoleezza Rice have been disinvited from speaking at some campuses in the US because feminists don't like them. And noted feminist atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali, her honorary degree from Brandeis University was cancelled just a year or two ago due to feminist student union complaints that she's not politically correct enough. In Toronto, Warren Farrell and Janice Fiamengo have been subjected to feminist protests aimed not at protesting their speech or presenting counter-speech, but at shutting their events down. And they were interviewed on camera, literally saying, "We're here to shut this event down." Troublingly, the criminal protest of the Warren Farrell talk, where protesters barricaded the doors and assaulted attendees and police, was supported by the University of Toronto's Women's Studies faculty and sponsored by the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Professor Fiamengo's talk at her own university in Ottawa, no less, had feminist students banging desks, blowing noisemakers, singing, shouting, and chanting, and refusing to comply with requests by security that they quiet down or leave. And her speaking engagement in that case was she just gave up. She just said, forget it, let's just call it off. Dr. Farrell's crime was that he wanted to talk about increasing rates of male suicide, decreasing rates of educational attainment for boys and young men, problems like pornography, video game, and internet addiction, and a growing failure to launch phenomenon that some of your parents might be acquainted with, that affects boys quite badly. Professor Fiamengo's crime was that she, as a former radical feminist, and having seen it from the inside, is now extremely critical of radical feminism and dubious about some of its theoretical doctrines and practices. Just last December, a law professor wrote an article in the New Yorker lamenting that she'd had students demand she not teach rape law anymore, as the subject is triggering for some students. This is particularly disturbing, given the fact that rape law has to be taught as a separate subject of the criminal law, because 40 years of reforms have rendered a rape trial a completely different beast than any other serious felony. The rules of evidence are different, court procedures are different, and certain forms of witness examination and cross-examination are prohibited altogether. In this professor's words, imagine a medical student who is training to be a surgeon, but who fears that he'll become distressed if he sees or handles blood, and then demanding that the curriculum be changed to accommodate it. According to her, several of her colleagues are considering dropping rape law from their curricula due to pressure from campus feminists and other progressive groups. Outside of classes and speakers and in the daily interactions of students, feminists on campuses in the US have pushed for a broad and extremely malleable definition of harassment. Despite such definitions failing several court challenges in the US, all the way up to SCOTUS, dozens of universities under pressure from feminist and progressive groups have discarded the reasonable person standard and base their harassment policies entirely on the subjective feelings of the alleged victim. Even more disturbingly, what this would mean is that if you were to ask a mentally ill young woman who hasn't been taking her meds if she'd like to have coffee, and she interprets that to mean he's going to rape me, her interpretation stands. That is the interpretation that the adjudication tribunal will take. Such a situation is the inevitable result of defining harassment solely based on the subjective feelings of the complainant. Even more, feminists in the US have thrown their support behind legislation dictating how university students have to conduct their sex lives. These policies, referred to as yes means yes laws or affirmative consent, they sound not scary at all. But they've been legislated in California and New York despite having failed several court challenges that found they essentially reverse the burden of proof. While these laws apply only to university students now and only to university hearings, there is a significant push by feminist activists and feminist organizations to try to incorporate them into the criminal justice system. So we may end up with, just in sexual assault law, we may end up with a cornerstone of our Western democracy just being put aside because due process and the burden of proof make it so that some men get away with it. One of the very interesting things about affirmative consent, when you transpose it against the new definition of harassment in universities in the US, is that it puts young men in a double bind. Not asking for consent before every single thing that you do is going to be, including hugging or kissing, it necessarily means that that act is an assault. But the mere act of asking for consent can be construed as harassment, all depending on whether the person you're asking is reasonable. Do you see why they call me a rape apologist? Also interesting is the push by feminists to promote an inquisitorial system on college campuses regarding sexual misconduct rather than the adversarial system that exists when adjudicating serious crimes in every single modern democracy. In the inquisitorial system, a single body acts not only as judge, jury, and executioner, but also investigator, prosecutor, and defense counsel. Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand in the US has publicly stated that now is not the time to concern ourselves with due process rights or the presumption of innocence, because such trivialities conflict with the interests of complainants. Now, in 1966, our new Prime Minister's father, Pierre Trudeau, asserted that there is no place for the state in the nation's bedrooms. He made his comment during the controversy over the decriminalization of homosexuality. Yet feminists seem to want to invite the state right back into our bedrooms, where I'm sure they will tell Liz that she should make her damn bed. And in what ways and for what reasons it is appropriate for citizens to have sex with each other. And of course, any resistance to these proposed measures, it will be met with accusations of misogyny, rape apology, and worse. When I was in New Hampshire on that panel with Naomi Wolf, I had the temerity actually to assert that rape is a hard crime to prove in court because it's based solely on state of mind consent. That the only physical evidence of sexual assault is also evidence of a perfectly legal act that millions of people across the globe are engaging in right now, consensually. And she called me a rape apologist in front of an audience of about 150 people. She was so upset moments later when I suggested that working class women in the 1800s probably did not feel oppressed by their own husbands, that she dropped an F-bomb and shouted, of course they did. And it was kind of a big disaster. And I cooled it after that because I was worried she wouldn't stick around for her keynote address, because she was really upset. This year, George Will had the gall to write an article in the Washington Post, wherein he suggested that our approach to rape is sexist. He argued that if two adults equally willingly drink, equally willingly get drunk, equally willingly decide to have sex with each other, when we presume that the man is a rapist and the woman is his victim, that can only be because of sexism. And as a result of a feminist smear campaign calling him a misogynistic rape apologist, he lost some of his contracts for his syndicated column. The St. Louis Dispatch was one of them. Bill Frezza, writing for Forbes from his perspective as the director on the national board of his former fraternity, recommended to current frat members that they turn young women away from their parties and events if those women had been pre-gaming, drinking before an event for any adults, grown-ups, people who aren't in school right now. His article was deleted within 3 hours due to a barrage of complaints originating at Jezebel, feminist website Jezebel, and he was fired. What was his crime? He suggested that the concern runs both ways, that we shouldn't just be concerned about drunk girls going into a frat house because they might get raped. We should also be concerned about the young men in that frat house and their liability, and that in order for them to stay safe, they should turn these girls away. And, well, caring about men, that gets you fired. Justin Bakula, a prominent member of the atheist skeptic community, was forced a couple of years ago to resign his position as head of his chapter of the Secular Coalition of America because he had the temerity to be skeptical about feminist claims of rampant sexual harassment and sexual assault at conferences and events. You heard me, a leader in the skeptic community was forced to step down because he was too skeptical. Now, he was ousted because these claims were completely unsubstantiated. They were vague, they were ephemeral. In fact, I was watching a live stream with one of these feminists making these claims, and she was asked, what do you tell women who say they've never experienced this? And she said, well, it's either internalized misogyny or they just haven't been trained how to see misogyny, how to recognize it. You know, if somebody actually hates me, I can usually tell. During his discussion of those claims, he mentioned a then prominent named Amy Roth, and he was quickly accused by other feminists of having doxed her. In response to these accusations, he linked to her Etsy page, where all of her information was available, uploaded by her, publicly. And to demonstrate that he hadn't revealed any personal information about this woman, at which point the accusations transmogrified into accusations that the mere act of linking her Etsy page was in itself doxing. So there's not a whole lot of rational thinking going on in these things. Meanwhile, the methods by which his enemies coerced him into stepping down included slander, libel, employment blacklisting, and an organized letter-writing campaign to his parents, who they doxed, to tell them what a horrible, misogynistic son they'd raised. Deluged by negative press and accusations of malfeasance, fueled by a giant game of internet telephone and hate mobs harassing his parents, he finally stepped down. He threw up his hands and said, it's not worth it. Only just recently, Tim Hunt, Nobel laureate and respected scientist, was forced to resign from several of his honorary positions after a feminist science journalist named Connie St. Louis made false and defamatory statements about him over Twitter. Statements that led to a mob of like-minded feminists demanding his head on a pike. Hunt was a speaker at a science journalism event in Korea, and he was asked to give a toast at the luncheon off the cuff. In his toast, he made a self-deprecating joke about what a dinosaur he is, and he's so glad that women in science are achieving things despite misogynistic monsters like him. His joke was greeted with laughter and applause. Connie St. Louis tweeted that it was greeted with stony silence and disapproval. He hadn't even gotten off the plane before his wife had been contacted by the London College, I believe, to let her know that if he wasn't going to step down from his honorary position there, they'd fire him. Now, numerous influential people, including several very high-achieving women, stepped in and defended him. And he was still vilified as a misogynist, and his reputation was just all but destroyed. When it became evident that Connie St. Louis had blatantly and repeatedly lied on her CV online for the university, she was not penalized at all. When the recording of the event emerged, showing that her version of events was a big old fabrication, she was not penalized at all. The mainstream press has really done little to correct the record. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever heard a feminist say, don't tell women how to dress? Women should be able to wear what they like without being blamed or shamed. Perhaps we could apply this to the feminist response to Matt Taylor's clothing choices the day he, with the help of a team of massively talented men and women, successfully landed a space probe on a comet millions of miles from Earth. On that day, he wore what he had come to describe as his lucky shirt. Not so lucky now. The shirt had been handmade for him by a female friend, the wife of one of his favorite tattoo artists. And if you've ever seen pictures of him, he's got full sleeves. He even had the probe landing on the comet tattooed on his thigh as a, to commemorate it. He's just covered with tattoos. He's a really cool looking guy. And he just absolutely got blasted. The next day, after feminists had accused him for days of essentially saying, they're essentially saying, you're the reason women won't go into STEM because you're sexist and you're a misogynist and you scare them. He was on TV sobbing an apology. Sobbing an apology because his shirt looked like it could have been a photo of the slut walk. And I guess that's not okay. So essentially, how long do I have? 30 seconds. Essentially what we have here is we have a pattern of behavior. We have a pattern of behavior on the part of feminists that when people say things they don't like, when people do things they don't like, when people engage in activities that they don't like, when people have sex the wrong way, that's not okay. Somebody's going to get put in jail. Somebody's going to get kicked out of school. Somebody's going to lose their job. That is a huge, massive problem in a society that values freedom of expression, and they have every right to express their opinion. Absolutely. And Tim Hunt has every right to tell a joke about himself without getting fired.